If you've just been joining us, we've been looking at the book of Judges, and today we're right at the end of the book of Judges. We're looking at the final chapters. We call this sermon series Good News in a Bad News World. And we said the world of Judges is bad news. It's a world of violence, exploitation, lies, manipulation, sexual assault. In other words, the book of Judges takes place in a world that's very similar to our world. But in the midst of the bad news, Judges tells us there's good news. It tells us that no matter how bad things look, God is still in control. It tells us that when it looks like nothing is working right, everything is gone off the rails, that God is working behind the scenes. We looked at Judges and we said that God does work through good people doing good things, but God also works through bad people, like Samson, who's doing bad things. That God can draw straight with crooked sticks. That he works through good people and good times, but also bad people and chaotic times. God is still yet in control. But today, as we close out Judges, we're going to see that Judges ends actually with no judges. We're going to look at these last few chapters, and we're going to see that things get so bad in Israel that their spirituality craters. And instead of worshiping God, the true God, calling on his name, they created their own gods for themselves. They've reduced God to a self-made God of their own image. And we're going to say that this idea of self-made religion is one of the greatest temptations of our time. The great temptation of our time is not that we become atheists, but we do continue to worship, but we worship a God that we actually made ourselves. We removed all the bad parts that we don't like, and we created this false God. It's one of the great dangers today, but it's empty and powerless. So we're going to explore this idea of self-made religion. We're going to look at three ideas. The allure of self-made religion, why people want this. Secondly, the problems of it. Last, we're going to look at the solution to self-made religion, how to avoid it, what's better than it. We're going to start with this idea of the lure of self-made religion. One of the big themes in Judges, if you just joined us, is that God's people, they enter into the promised land, God directs them there, but instead of living distinctly as God's people, they start wanting to be like everybody else, all the other nations. They start wanting to be like the Canaanites in their lust for power, sex, money, land. And instead of resisting that and living distinctly, they become like everybody else. Their gods become Israel's gods. Here in the final chapters of Judges, things get so bad, their spirituality craters so hard that they stop worshiping God in some sense altogether. They've reduced God to this graven image, this good luck charm. Self-made religion is the idea instead of worshiping the true God, we worship this false version of God that we created. And we see this most distinctly in this story of Micah. And the thesis of this whole chapter, actually the whole book of Judges, the very last verse, and all throughout Micah or Judges is this one verse. It's in 17:6. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Judges ends with this line. It's a thesis statement. And it's this idea that in this world, everyone's just doing their own thing. They have their own view of God, their own view of spirituality. And there is no leader. There's no one to lead the people. Micah was part of this, and his story exemplifies the whole problem. Micah was part of this really wealthy family. Opening chapters of Judges 17, he steals 1,100 pieces of silver from his mother. Now, it's bad enough that he steals an enormous sum of money, but it's worse that he steals it from his own mother, his own mom. Steals it. Verse 2, Mother doesn't know who stole it, so she utters a curse on whoever stole it. And Micah, as we learn, is a very superstitious dude. So he gets nervous, and he confesses to his mother he stole that money. The mom, instead of getting mad at his son, setting him straight, actually praises his son. Says, thank you for giving me this money back. I'm dedicating all of this silver to the Lord. And she does. In some sense, it says she dedicates 200 pieces of silver to the silversmith to make an idol. One of the questions is, well, I thought you dedicated 1,100 pieces to the Lord, but she only gives 200 to the silversmith. What's worse than that she lies about giving the money to God is that what she gives to God, she makes God into this image. The second commandment expressly forbids reducing God to an image that we worship. But maybe she doesn't even know the second commandment. She doesn't care. She makes this idol. And it says Micah is thrilled with the idol. He builds a shrine to it. And it says he ordains one of his sons to be a priest. You know, I was at a wedding a few years ago, and the brother of the groom was the officiant. And I was asking the groom, I was like, oh, I didn't know he was a pastor. He's like, oh, you know, for my wedding, he actually got ordained online. He took a two-minute quiz, and he printed out his ordination certificate. Man, it took me 4 years to go to seminary and learn Greek and Hebrew. Take 2 years of an internship. I had to pass all these tests. This brother took 2 minutes online, taking a quiz, printed out his ordination certificate. At the end of this 5-minute ceremony, wedding ceremony, he gave a Vulcan salute and said, live long and prosper. That was his message. You know, Micah ordaining his own son to be a priest was kind of like that. He kind of bypasses all the rules and regulations. It's only supposed to be a Levite, someone who trained their whole life to be a priest, dedicated their mind and heart to live out the word of God. But Micah, he don't want none of that. That's too complicated. Simply ordains his own son. But in verse 7, Micah actually meets an actual Levite. Remember, priests had to come from this specific tribe. So Micah has some ideas. He's not even actually a priest, though he's from the tribe of Levite. He gives him an offer. He wants to have his own personal Levite priest. Micah is driven by money, and he also assumes that this man is also driven by money. So he gives him an offer, a generous package. He says, hey, I'll give you a great salary. You have great benefits, health care, dental, 401k. You'll be set. Offers him this generous package. He's going to buy himself a priest. And the man agrees. And he eventually gets ordained. And he's thrilled. And in verse 13, this is why he's so happy about this. Micah says, now I know that the Lord will prosper me because I have a Levite as a priest. Micah now feels like he got a priest, and the reason he's so enthralled with that is that now he feels like, man, God has to bless me. I have my own priest. God's going to have to give me what I want. Micah has done two things. He's reduced God into this image, made him into something small, something manageable. And he's also, on top of that, feels like he can control God. Because I did this, God owes me. It's a way of controlling God. Micah does what a lot of modern people have done, is that we've taken God and we've reduced him to something smaller, something more manageable. You know, the reason the second commandment says we can't not make God into an image and worship it, is that inevitably when we reduce God and we make God into an image, we make him into something that we want, that we like, that's often like us. Sometimes I play video games with my kids. A lot of video games, you can design your own character. doesn't have to be the character they give you. You can design your own character, the hair color, the height, the skin color, the clothing. You can design it all yourself so it represents you. And in some sense, that's what we've done with God, was that we want to design our own God. And a lot of modern people do this all the time. We say, well, I believe in God, but, there's parts of God in the Bible I don't really like sin, hell, judgment. Let's take that out. I want to keep love, forgiveness, grace. I like that. And what we've done is that we built our own God. We reduced God to things that we like, not the God of the Bible. Ellen Mott, she says this: you can safely assume you created God in your own image when it turns out God hates all the same people you do. That we made God into our own image. He hates the same things we hate, he hates. Just so happens. But if God exists, what are the odds that God's going to be exactly like you? Have all of your preferences? Have all of your same desires, ethics? Are we worshiping God, or have we created our own version of God? One time I was talking to someone who was hostile to Christians and Christianity, and I asked them, what is the God that you think I worship? He's like, well, I think your God is very hateful, very angry, very judgmental. And I was like, well, I wouldn't worship a God like that either. That's not actually the God I worship. And you see, religious people and not religious people, they do the same thing. They make God into their own image. They have distortions of who God is. What Micah is doing is that he's reducing God. He's making God into something he is not. He's making him into his own image. And why does he do that? Well, in verse 13, he says it. He says, now I know God will prosper me, because I have a Levite as my priest. Micah has this idol, hires this priest, so now God owes him. That's the heartbeat of religion. Years ago, I was looking for an office in downtown for the church. Came across this building owner, leasing, older Chinese American man. He wasn't Christian, but he was loosely, vaguely religious, like a lot of people in Los Angeles. And he said, the last time I rented to a pastor in a church, my occupancy rates went up. Every place got rented out. So he's like, I want to rent to you. I'll actually give you a deal. Because, pretty confident, same things happen. God's going to bless me. I didn't like his reasoning, but I did take the deal. I want to be honest with you. I did take the deal. I didn't really like the reasons for it, but I couldn't. Yeah, that's a good deal. I didn't argue with him. But in reality, he was saying the same thing as Micah. I'm going to do this good thing because if I do it, God owes me. I got God. He's in my pocket now. A lot of religious people, we're not motivated by real worship. God, I want to honor you. I want to give to you. But we want to do these things for God because God owes us. If I sacrifice for God, I give my time, my money, my efforts, God's going to bless me. That's religion. It's not a relationship with God. You see, Micah, his idea of religion is very alluring because we can reduce God, make him a lot smaller and manageable. He doesn't say or do anything that's going to offend us or hurt us. We can also do that, make some sacrifices. Hey, God got us. He owes us. He's going to bless us. It's all set up. That's the allure of religion. But in the next chapter, we see the problems with it. This is the next point, the problems of self-made religion. Micah's set up, but in this next chapter, everything collapses. In the second chapter, it opens with the Danites. They're a tribe of Israel, but their problem was they didn't have a land. All the other tribes, they found land in the promised land, but Danites, they don't have land. So send out spies looking for a promised land. And they come across Micah's priest. And they ask the priest, is God going to help us find a land? Are we going to find a land? And the priest says, yes, God's going to bless you. He's going to bless all your endeavors. Spies find the most beautiful land. It's called Laish, and the people are living large. It's bountiful. Best of all for him, they're not protected. They have no fortification, no walls, no armies. They're vulnerable. So the spies go back and they bring an army with them. And on the way to conquering that land, they stop by again to Micah's house. And what they want to do is they want to take his idols, and they also want to take the priest. It's going to be their good luck charm. Again, they think, hey, if I got Micah, got the priest of Micah, his idols, God's going to bless us. Same mentality. In verse 19, they confront the priest, but instead of forcing him to go with the army, they give him an offer. Verse 19. Isn't it better for you to be a priest of not one house, of one man, but an entire tribe? You see, Micah has turned everything into this financial transaction. Hey, come with me. I'll make you rich. You'll have everything you need. But by doing that, he sets in motion, he becomes susceptible to market forces. This army, this tribe comes, and they give him a better offer. They say to Micah's priests, I know you're in it for the money, so here's the thing. We're going to give you more money. I know you're in it for yourself, but here's the thing. Hey, isn't it better for you to have more followers, to have all these other people hearing your voice, all this other influence? You're just a priest of one tiny house. We can make you the priest of an entire tribe that has influence over the nation. What does the priest say? Well, he's in it for himself. So in verse 20, it says, his heart was glad. Man, he's happy. He's moving on to bigger and better things. You know, one of the persons I've read and learned about the most about pastoring is a pastor. His name is Eugene Peterson. And his main prophetic voice for churches today is he says churches in America have become businesses and pastors have become businessmen. It's one of his main critiques. Churches are all about the market, getting more and more people. That's the bottom line. Not getting deeper and deeper spirituality, but more and more people, the masses. And pastors are all about that as well. And when a pastor is given a better offer, like Micah's priest, more money, bigger church, more opportunities, that's where they go. Just like in Micah's time, we're driven by the market. The temptation of the church today is to become like the world. You know, the church today is pulled apart by two competing forces. One is politics, and the other is the market. Those are the two competing forces that the church is working against. This last week was the election. And after the election, you were one of two ways. Either you were ecstatic or you were completely defeated. Why is that? And one of the reasons for that is that politics has become everything. It's taken over everything. More and more, our society is politicized. We politicize things that have nothing to do with politics, like vaccines or science or libraries. Everything is political. It's taking over everything. And so we think when a party wins or loses, it's either everything or nothing. But the church is supposed to stand against that. We're supposed to say, hey, this is my president, but he's not my king. God is my king. I swear allegiance to him, not any person. Church is supposed to stand against the market. The market is the other force. It's about money. It's about growth. But we're supposed to stand against that as well. You know, so many people in the church today, they are thinking about jobs and careers purely on the basis of the market. What's the job opportunities and what pays the best? But if you think about it, Christians should be the people who stand apart from that and say, well, The thing I really want to focus on is, how can I be used of God? How can I be a blessing to my neighbor? Now, money and politics, they're not nothing. I'm not saying they're nothing, but they're not everything. They're not the main thing. The church today, we are so tempted to follow the culture. It's all about politics. It's all about market. It's all about numbers. It's all about power. But the church's supposed to be different. It's supposed to be apart from those forces. But here, in Judges, the church, God's people, they're just like everybody else. It's the highest bidder. It's pure power. Micah, he sets in motion this idea that religion is market, it's power. But he succumbs to it because there's a bigger market, a bigger power that takes over. They steal Micah's idols. They give Micah's priests a better offer. And at the end, Micah's powerless. He comes running out, confronts them, and he basically says, well, how could you steal everything I have? Notice his appeal is not to morality or not to God. He's appealing to their common sense. But they appeal to their common sense. They're like, well, I have 600 men with me. And they say to Micah, Micah, you don't want to get this you don't want this to get out of hand, do you? You don't want anyone getting hurt, do you? Appeal to power. And Micah, he stands down. The idol, his priests, they walk away. Here's the problem with self-made religion. If you made up your God, make him small and manageable and easy, it's very convenient. You can do anything you want, but that God you made up cannot save you. It cannot rescue you. Notice that Micah never prays to God, never appeals to God's help or God's voice, because he knows in the heart of hearts they're not real. He knows that a fake God can only give you a fake salvation. A pretend God can only pretend save you. In Judges, whenever people call out to God, the real God, God answers. God comes down. God sends a deliverer. God rescues even through the smallest of forces, Gideon, even through one man, flawed as he is, Samson. But every time people call out to the real living God, he answers in a powerful way. But because Micah has made God small, manageable, easy, he realizes that God can't save me. There's no use praying to that God. The problems with a false God is a false God cannot save you, cannot rescue you, cannot electrify you, cannot transform you, can't change you. It's a superstitious relic. It's not in your bulletin, but right after this, the story of the Danites is that they go on to conquer this unsuspecting people of Laish. They conquered them in the most brutal way. They burned down the entire city. God never told them to do that. In the most brutal, bloody way, kill all the inhabitants. That's not God's will. Judges represents the worst of what religion can become. It's not about connecting with God. It's about money. It's about power. It's about land. It's about getting what is ours in God's name. And that's the rub of it. Judges represents the most worst of what religion can become. It's not about God. It's self-made. It's about getting what we really at the heart want in our lives. One of the sad things about Dan is that they go on to totally remake the city. They set up this false idol. They set up their false priests. But the history of Dan is that they go so far astray from God that they stop identifying as God's people. You know, in Revelation 7, 5-8, there's a list of the 12 tribes of Israel. All 12 tribes. But what is conspicuously missing from that list is a tribe of Dan. It's not on the list anymore. The tribe belonging to Joseph is repeated twice in different ways to make up for the fact Dan no longer a people of God. The tribe of Dan is a cautionary tale about the dangers of self-made religion, of worshiping a God that we have made ourselves. 2 Timothy 3:5, it says, the Apostle Paul says that in the last days, a lot of people are going to claim to be religious. They're going to look godly. They're going to say all the right things. But it says that their life is going to be empty of power. And that's the problem. That's the danger of Christian people today, is that we say we worship God, but we've actually reduced God. We make God into our own image. And we don't have any spiritual power in our life. Our life is not changed. So here's the final point. Well, what's the solution to self-made religion? The main thesis of Judges is this. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. The problem in Judges and now is that everyone has their own views and opinions. They have their own views of who God is and what God's like. But nobody's listening to God. No one is listening. There's no leader. There's no king to draw them all close together. Here in Judges 16 and 17, the tribe has reduced God down to size, made them into his own image to do God's bidding. What's the solution? What did Micah need? And the key verse said, well, the people of Micah and the people of our time, we need a king. In fact, the whole book of Judges is really setting up this theme of the need for a king. The next book after Judges chronologically is the book of Ruth. Ruth is an immigrant woman, powerless. She comes to Israel, has a children, and that child becomes eventually David's father. And right after Ruth is what? 1 Samuel, which is about King David. And really all of Judges is setting you up for King David. About this need that God's people have gone astray, but they need a king to bring them back. They need a righteous king. They need a righteous king to bring them, protect them, to give them wisdom they never had. To have a righteous king who brings stability and peace, that Hebrew word shalom, the flourishing of life. But we realize even in David, hey, this king is not, he's super flawed. I mean, he did do some good things, but he's a flawed king. That's why all of Judges is ultimately about our need for the King of Kings. This one to finally come down. The Bible says that all of us are like sheep. We've gone astray. We're doing our own thing. We have our own views. We have our own gods. We're tempted to be like everybody else, pursue the gods of sex, of money, of power, of comfort. But the gospel is this idea that this king has come all the way down. We finally have a king. Gospel of John, it says, the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. How do we keep from worshiping something that's not God, reducing God? And the answer is, look to Jesus. Jesus is the image of God. We can't make any images of God because there's only one image of God, and that's Jesus. Well, what is God like? What does he want? Look at Jesus. He's come down to show us who he is. He's full of grace and truth. Jesus is not like the idols that have been created. Idols are put in a box, they're reduced. But we saw with Jesus that he cannot be put in a box. Idols never challenge you, but Jesus is constantly challenging, especially religious people. He challenges truth. He challenges by his truth. He speaks to power. He criticizes the Pharisees for being hypocritical. He goes to the temple and it's become a marketplace. It's all business. And he overturns those tables. And he says, how dare you turn this house of prayer for the nations into a marketplace? Jesus doesn't fit into a box. You couldn't have made Jesus up. He challenges us. Jesus wasn't just speaking truth, he was full of grace. John says he brought peace upon peace, grace upon grace, one level of grace to another level of grace. John chapter 4, we just studied this in our Newcomers Bible study. Jesus crosses all kinds of barriers to talk to this woman. She's been married 5 times. That's a lot of times. She is a Samaritan. Religiously, ethnically, gender-wise, Jesus crosses all those barriers. And he tells this woman who's an outcast amongst her own people of outcasts. She's been married 5 times. And Jesus essentially, if you boil it down, says to her, I'm the man you've been looking for your whole life. You have 5 husbands, you're sleeping with someone who's not your man. You have this thirst in your life for love, for meaning. I'm the man you've been looking for your whole life. Jesus calls himself the groom all throughout John. He's basically saying to her, I'm your groom. I'm that one you've been looking for your whole life. Jesus, he doesn't fit into any boxes. He speaks truth. He tells us truthful things that we would never make up. He exposes us. He calls us sinners. He exposes our self-centered motives even by doing good things. But he gives us astonishing grace. He forgives the deepest of our sins. He includes outcasts, thieves, prostitutes. He welcomes us to their table, his table, and calls us sons, daughters. He could never have made Jesus up. But in the most astonishing act, Jesus dies for us. What we've seen in Judges is that everybody with power uses it for themselves. They use their power to exploit other people, take their land, their women, their property. But in the most astonishing act, Jesus, who had all the power, relinquishes it all for us, sacrificially, to bring us to God. Have you met this image of Jesus? A real God electrifies you, challenges you, tells you things you don't want to hear, but also protects you and loves you, forgives you. Have you ever sensed the greatness of God in your life? A sign that you serve a small God is that everything in your life is very dutiful and transactional. I do this, God does that. But nothing ever thrills you about God. God never tells you to do things you don't want to do. Tells you to go places and love people you don't want to love. Your enemies, I don't want to love them. And false God never tells you to be uncomfortable. He just tells you what you want to hear. But the true God electrifies you, changes you, commissions you, tells you to go to people you don't want to go to, tells you to love them like Jesus loved you. The true God of the Bible is a God of fire. He moves you in unexpected ways. Well, maybe you have a false God and that's comfortable and that's all good. But remember, when you hit rock bottom, that false God cannot save you, cannot give you a peace that transcends all understanding, cannot give you a hope beyond this life. That small God can only give you a small fake salvation. But the true God will call you to do hard things, but will be with you, electrify you, change you, transform your life. I want to close with this passage. It's from the story of Blaise Pascal. He's a French philosopher, mathematician, and he had a moment in his life that radically changed him, so much so he wrote down exactly what happened, wrote it up into a small piece of paper, and he put it in the lining of his coat. In fact, that no one ever knew about it until he died. They found it. This is what that passage says. Fire, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of the philosophers and of the learned, certitude, feeling, joy, peace, God of Jesus Christ, my God and your God will be my God, forgetfulness of the world and of everything except God. He is only found in the ways taught in the gospel. Grandeur of the human soul, righteous Father, the world has not known you, but I have known you. Joy, 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 tears of joy. He said it lasted for 2 hours. That word fire is printed at the top all throughout. Transformed his life. Pascal met a God that couldn't fit in a box, but it was a God of fire. Have you met that God of fire? Are you worshiping a false God? You might be religious on the outside, but have you met this God of fire, of grace, of power, of love? Well, this is the day. This is a day for you to know, to welcome that God to transform your life. Are you trying to make God into your own image, or are you saying, God, make me into your image? I don't want you to be like me. I want to be like you. I will follow whatever you say, go wherever you lead. That's the true disciple. Will we follow this God of fire in Jesus? Please join me in prayer.